Well, good morning to the UK column viewers and, of course, our listeners. It's Sunday morning. It's August the 28th. It's just after 11:30, and I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Christian Buckland. Now, Dr. Buckland has been talking to the UK column previously. We've had some very interesting discussions. He is, of course, a psychotherapist. He's been working, amongst other things, alongside people who've suffered vaccine adverse reactions. And he's kindly agreed to join me this morning to have a little informal chat about Rishi Sunak's recent statement that he wasn't very happy with how lockdown and other measures were brought in. So I'm going to say straight away, Dr. Buckland, thank you very much for joining me. How are you? Written in 2010. It was a UK government document. It was produced by the Cabinet Office. And what is so significant about this document is it's like a very simplistic overview of what the government was doing in its applied behavioral psychology program. And as you've said, it did also highlight that the government had to be careful, because if the public perceived that they weren't being informed of these quite sophisticated behavioral techniques, there could be a backlash against the government. And so that was the Mindspace document. People can still get a copy of that by simply searching online for Mindspace as a .pdf. That's MINDSPACE.pdf. You should find it. And if you look at page 66 of that document, at the bottom of that page, it says something like, by these techniques, we will be able to change the way people think and behave, but those individuals will not necessarily know their behavior has changed, or if they do, they won't know how we have changed it, which is a pretty shocking statement, I think. And then just to clarify, the second document that you'd focused on were the minutes of the SPI-B meeting back in March 2020. And that was the one where the specialist psychology team within the SAGE organization, or alongside it, was talking about how they were going to use applied psychology. So I just wanted to clarify those two. But can I just focus you in on a little bit? Because, of course, the minutes talked about what they were going to do. But you rightly pointed out to me the other day that page 3 and 4 of those minutes also had a very simplistic risk assessment that was drawn up in a table. I don't know whether you want to comment about that at all.
So that's the bit that I'm saying there. It is clear to me that there was some discussion of a risk assessment done for using fear and shame, because they say there could be a negative spillover effect, I think is the word. And to me, it's like, well, okay, well, what have you documented? What is that? You can't just say there could be some risks. I thought it was really interesting that everything else was, the spillover effect was positive, neutral, and anything negative could be negative, as if it was kind of, taking a guess. I think there's been a deliberate attempt to hide what those negative spillover effects could be.
In saying that, we now get into an even more concerning level, because this shows the government being devious in using psychology in the way it presents its own reports on how it is using psychology.
What I'm trying to say is, I don't know why there isn't a risk assessment. I would have thought there should have been a risk assessment, and that's all I can find that looks like it could be. So there might be one somewhere, but it's just made me realise, when Rishi Sunak said that parts of minutes had been edited, the first sort of thing that went through my head was, could it be the risk assessment that's been edited out? Because, as I say, I think then if that had stayed in, I think a lot more people would have realised this could be a really, really bad idea, because maybe only all of the positives of using fear, shame, and guilt were being discussed. And if you don't actually understand psychological techniques and how psychology can be really dangerous, then you might not be aware. You know, in my profession, I would never dream of trying to scare someone into changing their behaviors, because I know, number one, it's unethical, and secondly, it will cause long-term severe damage. You know, and so maybe other people don't know the damage, and the reason we don't use those techniques in my profession when we're working with clients and patients is because psychology is about co-construction. It's not about getting someone to submit and change because they're frightened. You don't do that. As I say, it's about co-construction. And the other thing I probably want to say is the reason why I think this is really important is because we're going to see the same techniques rolled out for many other different agendas unless we push back and say, this isn't on, this isn't right. So we're going to see them, whether it's, you know, well, I just think we all know that we're seeing them at the moment. So I do want to encourage people to be sort of asking for, number one, things like risk assessment, which I know you've been asking for over 2 years. But I also want people to kind of be saying, we're not happy with you trying to change our behaviors on an unconscious level, because, you know, something that sometimes doesn't get acknowledged is just how behavioral science does penetrate into people's unconscious and can change their behaviors. You know, there's lots of different techniques. I've just talked very briefly about fear, shame, and guilt here, but you just have to look at some of the language that's been used. You know, for example, the three-word slogans, you know, those are designed to penetrate into people's unconscious, so they end up behaving without thinking. So there are all these different techniques that are being able to nudge us in a direction that potentially we don't want to go down. And I think there has to be some level of pushback to say, hold on, we're not happy with this. Otherwise, it's going to be used all the time. And I don't want to live in a world where I'm constantly being told to be afraid or be guilty or be embarrassed or shamed.
Thank you very much for that. It's a very very interesting summary. As I look at the whole of the COVID situation, there were two areas for me. One is that fear was used in relation to how dangerous COVID was. That was the first thing. And then fear was also used actually it's three things, isn't it? It was into the COVID itself, you're going to die, or many people are going to die of COVID. Then we had fear to achieve the lockdown and the social distancing. And we also had, it seems to me, a fear agenda to get people to be jabbed without considering the full range of benefits and risks. So the government, or areas of the government, must have known what they were trying to do here. And all of the information I've read about the behavioral insights team from the outset, when they were doing their early work on how they could use behavioral insights in order to promote government policy, they were very, what is the word? I could say arrogant. They were very pleased with themselves about how powerful these tools were. And clearly they didn't seem to have any particular constraints on how they would use these things. In all of the material I read, even when I discovered that the Behavioral Insights team had initially targeted DEFRA, that was Farming and Food, Department of Farming and Food, that was where one of the early projects for behavioral psychology was unleashed. Even that £34 million project, I never did see any risk assessment on what possibly the adverse effects were going to be. So I think this lack of attention to risks has been prevalent from the earliest stages by these teams.
I think that, you know, behavioral psychology it can be really helpful, and it can be used for really important things. I use it in my job. It's an important technique and tool in my toolbox. But I have an ethical framework I have to uphold, and you know, if I use it unethically, I can get pulled up. And I think that's what I'm asking for and saying is really important here, is that there are more and more ethical frameworks drawn up for the use, whether it's governments or organisations, companies, whatever. There has to be frameworks drawn up. So that's why I was so pleased to see UNICEF producing something for behavioural science working with children, because absolutely that is key, especially when I've talked about my concern about some of those guilt messaging that was put out. But there needs to be more broader ethical frameworks drawn up to ensure the public aren't harmed, because that is my risk. My worry here is actually we can cause, if we don't highlight the problems that have happened with the COVID narrative, we will see more harm being done in the future.
Right. Well, Dr. Buckland, I'm going to say thank you very much for that. I think it's been a very useful analysis overview of what's happening. And of course, we wouldn't be having this conversation in this way had it not been for Rishi Sunak speaking out. So I think it's going to be fascinating to see what now happens around him, whether he stands his ground or whether he's sort of bullied into submission and, don't speak out on this subject. It's going to be really interesting.
Absolutely. I think we just got to watch this space and see what happens next. But I am surprised. Well, I don't know if I am surprised, but I found it interesting to see how many reports he just read out that were attacking him for saying it.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, we will leave it there. I'm sure we'll be having future discussions about this, because it is such a big subject, even though it's been really hidden in plain sight. It's been there under the surface of the public perception. Perhaps Richie's comments are going to do something really positive, which is bring the whole subject to the surface. So let's hope that's the case. Okay, well, thank you very much for giving up part of your Sunday morning. Thanks for joining me.